There has been celebratory gunfire. There have been military parades for the 1 year anniversary of the fall of the 53-year Assad regime.
Well, it is a great example of how someone labeled a terrorist, much like Mary Adams and Martin McGuinness in Ireland were terrorists, have evolved into, let's face it, a successful politician.
People were there, even the Taliban, the Haqqanis came from Afghanistan because they think he is their example of how to get out of the, terrorist cold.
People were scared to talk to each other. People were scared to admit what they thought. People were scared to go out in the streets during many of these years. This is a traumatized country.
Honestly, you just cannot believe that a human being at the head of a government can order his henchmen to do what they did, and including children and women, and absolutely horrendous. The guy is Islamic. I tried, I slid my hand forward, and immediately he slapped it to here, like the Islamic government members of Iran. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The X-Files with me, Christiane Amanpour.
And Jamie Rubin.
And of course, I'm a longtime CNN correspondent. I've been in the field for a long time, many decades, and also have my own show where I try to put all this into context and interview leaders and try to hold them accountable.
And you do that well. So I am a former State Department official for Secretary of State Blinken under President Biden and Madeleine Albright under President Clinton.
So I got lucky this weekend because I interviewed the now 1 year in president of Syria, Ahmed al-Sharaa. And we are going to divide this episode into several segments. The first is on Syria 1 year after Assad fell, and what has al-Sharaa done for the country? Should the West actually have done more to stop Assad? How much has Syria changed? And then in our second segment, we are going to discuss the literally unbelievable, I think so anyway, I'm sure, Jamie, you do too, the new American national security strategy essentially boils down to, I'm sorry, but seeming to put Russia first, to bring Russia in from the cold, and to actually put Europe and the EU out into the cold. So this is a very weird situation. Let's start then, Jamie, shall we?
Let's do it.
Let's just do a quick recap of how we got to the fall of Assad. So Bashar Assad came to power in Syria in 2000 after the death of his father, Hafez Assad, who had ruled since taking over in 1971. This was a quasi-military, but most definitely a one-family dictatorship. In 2011, when we were all covering the Arab Spring, and I was in Egypt here and there, we never got to Syria because the uprising in Syria in 2011 was the worst. It was the beginning of the worst of the Arab Spring, when Bashar Assad, who had been touted as some new young version of a Syrian dictator, actually then cracked down, believing he was in a fight for his life, even though the Syrians had not called for him to be overthrown. They just said they wanted more liberty and democracy and this and that. But he cracked down very, very hard, including on the children who first demonstrated in Daraa. And that has become, as you know, this symbolism and this what was synonymous with the start of the revolution against Assad, as it turned out, and the whole civil war. Um, Jamie, this followed obviously it was during the last years of the Obama administration.
Yes, this was unfortunately one of the low moments of American foreign policy and the Obama administration. Perhaps because such fear developed of another Iraq war, when the time came for the United States to do something in Syria, not fix the whole problem, not invade, nothing like that, but simply to follow through on the red line that President Obama has established if Assad used chemical weapons, the United States didn't follow through. And this was a terribly tragic moment because, one, it raised questions about the willingness of President Obama to use and follow through on promises all over the world. But most important, it let Russia intervene in a big way. Yes, we got rid of the chemical weapons, at least some of them, but Russia intervened, and the combination of Russia and Assad and Iranian ground troops caused the deaths of perhaps 500,000 Syrians and the destruction of that country practically, with most of its people moving around either inside the country or all over the world. And that was the refugee crisis that Europeans dealt with during the mid to 2010s. And it caused a lot of problems in Europe. But then something very, very strange happened. And something that led to the overthrow of Assad. When President Trump came to power, because he did follow through on his threat to use force if Assad's forces used chemical weapons. He did it twice. Not a big deal. He launched, I don't know, 50 cruise missiles on the Assad military bases. They were concerned. They worried. Trump had real power. And so one day, and you told this story, and maybe we can get into it later, Trump decided to tell Putin and Assad not to finish off the rebels in Idlib, the northwest corner of Syria, where they had all gathered. And he put out a tweet, and they were about to invade the last bit of Syria they didn't control, and they didn't. And what's so ironic about that and so important historically is that's the place where al-Sharaa
Yeah,
was ruling and al-Sharaa's people were in control. And many, many years later, actually almost a decade later, that's the place from which
right.
Assad was overthrown.
And it's actually very significant. I don't know whether Trump knew about, as he was known then, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. That was his nom de guerre during the, let's face it, he was a member of their version, the local version of Al-Qaeda, and he led a group that actually the United States called a terrorist group. And for a long time, the United States had a bounty on al-Sharaa's head. But then, as you say, exactly a year later, a year ago, he stormed his troops up to out of Idlib and up to Damascus, and cities and provinces, villages fell in his wake, and it was pretty bloodless actually, that part of it, because Assad fled and the Russians, if you remember, regrouped on the coast, and they, I think, got into their ships that were off the coast. They didn't intervene to stop, as he was called then, Jolani, nor did the Iranians. Anyway, he got to Damascus and he became the de facto and now the interim president of Syria, known as Ahmed al-Sharaa. And he has now met with President Trump. And right now, today, as we record, December 8th, there has been celebratory gunfire, celebratory, not the kind that, killed so many people under the Assad regime. There have been military parades. There's been a whole amount of color and a lot of celebrations for the 1 year anniversary of the fall of the 53-year Assad regime. So he came to the Doha Forum where I was this weekend, and we were able to talk about a lot of things. Before I get into that, though, Jamie, let's just go back for these last few months. I said to him in my opening, you've been here, there, and everywhere, the UN, the White House, Saudi Arabia, everywhere. So just you talk a little bit about how he's presented himself to the world leaders.
Well, it is a great, great example of how someone labeled a terrorist, much like Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness in Ireland were terrorists, have evolved into, let's face it, a successful politician. Now, remember, his family is a prominent family. And so he grew up in a family that understood power and understood the Syrian government. And he has exercised power very wisely. He sent out all the right messages to everyone and he managed, and this I give President Trump some credit for because I think a Democratic president probably wouldn't have acted so quickly. But Trump loves to have peace and successful changes. And so he quickly suspended sanctions on Syria. And that was a major development for the Syrians. Once the United States had done that, the world opened up to al-Sharaa. He came to the UN, as you said. He's now met President Trump. And people are very, very, very optimistic that this evolution of a former terrorist into a politician could bode well for Syria and open that country up after, let's face it, really one of the horror stories of the modern era. I mean, the trauma that that country went through every family, every region, every ethnic group. It's a complicated place. It's one of the hearts of the Arab world, and now it has a chance to really shine. It'll take many, many years to reconstruct and to build, but al-Sharaa is doing, I would say, a credible job of persuading Western leaders who may be skeptical of his past to give him a chance.
Okay, so let's take a few issues because from October, late October to mid-November, for precisely this anniversary, there is a poll that's been taken by Arab Barometer, which is a nonprofit research network. Okay, so it's the first ever survey of Syrian people across the board. They interviewed, I think, nearly 1,300 randomly selected adults in person in their own language, whether they were Kurdish or Arab speaking. And the results were very interesting because they actually found that al-Sharaa himself had 81% support from Syrians, i.e., 81% of Syrians are confident in al-Sharaa, 71% are confident in the national government as a whole, and 62% are confident in the courts and the legal system. 71% support the army. Now, this, though, doesn't tell the whole story because, and I'm just going to, Jamie, well, talk about this for a minute because, I mean, that's never happened. Maybe for a minute or an afternoon when young, so-called westernized, educated in England eye doctor Bashar Assad took over from his very rigid, Baathist, right, dictator father, Hafez, in 2000. There was a tinsy-wincy moment when they thought, all these young people were going to open up the Middle East and that part of the world, and they didn't. So just 81% is quite a high poll rating.
I think it's dramatic, it's important, and I think what it reflects is the exhaustion in that country with the war, with the hatred, with the ethnic violence, with the misery that all have gone through, and because al-Sharaa has said the right things and done the right things and appears to be trying to create a tolerant Syria, the people wanna give him a chance, and I think that's, crucial because with the support of his people, with people not immediately going to retribution, because there's a lot of retribution that could take place in that country.
Well,
I think
that's we're gonna talk
they are
about because it's
exhausted.
happening. Mm.
Yeah, they're exhausted. Some is taking place, but I think he's done said the right things, and I think that poll number is a reflection of people's desire for Syria to succeed, and they want to give him a chance, a fresh chance, to show that he can do the right thing and do it in the right way.
So, I read on stage in Doha, and by the way, it was full. I don't know how many people that hall holds, but it was packed to the rafters. He was the main event, and people were there. Even the Taliban, the Haqqanis, came from Afghanistan because they think he is their example of how to get out of the, terrorist cold and into
Yeah, I don't think
accepted.
they're gonna be as successful as he
In any event,
will.
they were absolutely determined and they did get a meeting with him. But what I'm saying is he was incredibly popular in that hall. People were just hanging on his every word. And even though, there are some regional actors there who don't like him and still call him Jolani, you can imagine who they are. The people who were, pro the Assads, and propping him up. They really were, he really played to the crowd and he's a very good communicator. But when I asked him about, okay, this is a very, very, important poll, I said people say now to me that they dare to dream and they dare to hope, even though they still have challenges. But I said, look, there are also a lot of people who are afraid of you, the Alawites, the Druze. There have been these massacres, this mass
Kurds,
displacement. Yeah, the Kurds to an extent, although they're less afraid and more, they don't want to be picked off. They want to be respected as a group
separated.
that's a part of Syria. But Jamie, look at this. In Latakia, Sueda, Tartus, which is all of the way over towards the coast, fewer than that 81% have confidence in the national government. Apparently, 36% in the courts, 33%, in the army, 22%, and in the president himself, 36%. Because the people in that in those sort of minority governorates, as they're called, are pretty afraid. Um, and just 35% of them believe the government is responsive to their concerns. So I asked him about that. We're going to play his answer and we can talk about it.
Today, we cannot say that the revolution in Syria was a Sunni revolution. All the components of the Syrian society were part of the revolution. The Christians were affected by the previous regime. Even the Alawite had to pay the price of them being used by the former regime. So I do not agree with the definition or with saying that all the Alawites were supporting the regime. Some of them were living in fear. They were fearing the toppling or what will happen if the regime is toppled. When we went into Alawite villages, we saw a lot of poverty and problems. In fact, we have inherited a big problem where all of us are victims. It is a big problem that we need to deal with very wisely.
So, Jamie, you know, he didn't like it. He didn't accept the premise that a lot of people were afraid, but then he did admit that atrocities had happened and there needs to be a pretty speedy accountability, which he said was, beginning. Okay, so how do you react to him just reacting to that question?
Well, I think it's an example of the sensitivity of the subject. They don't want to uh, talk about the fact that Syria is a riven society, riven between, Alawites and Sunnis, between Kurds and Sunnis, between Druze and the government. They don't like to talk about it because they're proud of the idea that Syria will be a
Yeah.
country where all of the different ethnic and religious groups can work and live together, which frankly they did over the years under different governments.
Yeah.
And one other thing about the Assad family that's worth people remembering, remember they were part of the father, Hafez, was part of the Ba'ath Party, this socialist Arabist party that Saddam Hussein was part of. But they were were rivals. Saddam and Hafez Assad were from the same political background, but they hated each other. Syria joined the West in the war against Iraq back in 1991. So they're going to have to transform from a country that was, Hafez Assad and Bashar's picture hung over every street corner. People were scared to talk to each other. People were scared to admit what they thought. People were scared to go out in the streets during many of these years. This is a traumatized country. And I think what al-Sharaa is trying to say is, yes, there are serious problems here, but we're going to go about it in a fair and tolerant way. And we're not going to focus our energies on these ethnic conflicts. We don't want to promote that as the main story about Syria because what they want is the rest of the world to reinvest, to join in Syria, to help them turn what is, essentially one giant battlefield into a place that can thrive again. And that is going to be extremely difficult. It's going to require very, very careful governance and the support of much of the Arab world and much of the outside world. And that's, like many leaders, what he wants to focus on, the optimism and the positive. So when you bring up the negative, which is real and honest, and you needed to do that,
Oh,
he's
yeah.
going to find a way to try to change the subject.
Yeah, I had to do it because A, everybody's talking about it, and B, um, apparently, it's a unified Syria that is going to, encourage outside investment. Unity is their big national strength and their big objective. They need that. I think that some of those sanctions the US has suspended, but there's a bunch more, including those that were imposed under the Caesar Act. Now, I interviewed this guy who went by the name Caesar. He was the one who very bravely under the Assad regime and during the civil war, he went into the Sednaya prison and took pictures and brought them out and then the Guardian and CNN, my show, broke this news. And then, as you know, the US imposed the Caesar sanctions and the Caesar law. All this to say that they haven't yet, lifted it. So he's trying to get the US to lift that. And of course, the atrocities in the summer against the Druze and the Alawites, they pull back the US Congress, but maybe they're going to do it pretty soon. It's a big thing. It means a huge amount, this unity business.
let's stay on that for a second because oddly enough, during the Trump administration, I think I've admitted this, I was a lobbyist. I was a registered lobbyist. I followed the laws, but one of my proudest moments was to lobby on behalf of a group of Syrian American doctors. And one of the doctors, a woman named Reem, who you also interviewed, is the one who persuaded Donald Trump to issue that tweet to save Idlib. She's a hero in Idlib because of that. But she also pushed the Congress into passing the Caesar Act because at that time, remember what we were dealing with? We
Yeah,
were
I
dealing
do.
with this horror of hundreds of thousands of people being slaughtered in the most gruesome, horrible ways recounted. And then, uh, lists were made and records were kept of all these monstrous atrocities. And Reem and the Syrian American doctors persuaded the Congress to pass the Caesar Act to try to put pressure on Assad because at that time the people didn't think that this little place Syria, Idlib, was going to be the place from which Assad would be overthrown, and sanctions was the only tool we had. And once you put sanctions in place, it's very, very difficult to lift them. And remember, the accountability for those crimes in Syria is something that's going to be take many, many years, if not decades, to track these people down. There's been some encouraging stories in Europe where they found some of Assad's henchmen hiding in various countries, and they're starting to prosecute them. This is going to be one of the biggest war crime stories of the modern era.
I saw those pictures from Sidnaya, and honestly, you just cannot believe that a human being at the head of a government can order his henchmen to do what they did, and including children and women, and I mean, absolutely horrendous. So, by the way, on the Caesar Act, it'll take the U.S. Congress to lift it, and we'll see whether they do that. Jamie, I just want to, just because we're getting to the end of this segment. I also asked him about, hey, you were accused of being a terrorist, you had a bounty on your head. Wha- what do you say to everybody here about it? And he turned it around pretty well. He basically said that he himself didn't do anything to any civilians, but he also turned it around and said, what do you say that Israel's doing against Gaza, or that Russia is doing in Ukraine, or that so he had his talking points. He had his talking points. But on the caliphate thing, and I think this is interesting, the guy is Islamic. I tried, I slid my hand forward, and immediately he slapped it to here, like the Islamic government members of Iran. So I'm like, okay. So I made a point of asking him about, okay, it's not a caliphate. Will it ever be a caliphate? What about women's rights? And he said, don't you worry. Women have always been strong in Syria, and don't fear for the women. You should fear for the men, because the women are very strong. So that was one that got a big laugh. He's pretty clever as a communicator, by the way. And then on the other thing, because there are a lot of people, Jamie, and who are afraid that he's going to just consolidate power like a typical regional, top dog, and stay there forever. So I asked him that. I said, it happens a lot in this part of the world. And he said, no, we're going to have elections. And I pushed him, and he said, well, in the 5 years since we got here. So he said, and now 1 year's gone. So in 4 years' time, we'll have the big important elections. So hopefully we'll be able to hold him to all of that.
Well, listen, one of the mistakes that the United States and the West has often made in the Middle East is to make elections the sine qua non of democracy. And there are things more important than your first election. It's called the rule of law. And I think establishing the rule of law in Syria, obviously not going on forever, but for a period of time where people can trust in government behaving fairly and law applying to everyone. And so that when the democracy moment of an election happens, there is a system in place where people get an opportunity to campaign properly, where there are real opposition parties, and the laws are in place that permit democracy to succeed because the first election often it can be the last we found in Egypt and other places. And what we want is for Syria to put together its history of tolerance for women, for men, for the different religious groups, the ethnic groups, but to combine that with representative government that is based on the rule of law. And I would hope and expect the world to focus on that. Unfortunately, the current administration doesn't much care about these things, the rule of law in foreign countries. They are in their new strategy, which we're going to get to in a minute. They basically dismiss the whole human rights subject. And I think it's a shame that at a moment when Syria is at this turning point, we're not going to have an American president who's going to encourage him in the ways that I think we should to, yes, accept that he's in power now and we can work with him and that's good. But we need to establish procedures, processes, and laws and fairness and tolerance that will survive that first election.
Which he sort of implied when he said that we're doing the whole constitutional process and it'll take 5 years and only then can we have these elections. Just one thing that I forgot to say, but it's important. He also talked a lot about massive incursions by Israel and the massive incursion on the ground by Israel to just about, on the outskirts of Damascus. And we know it bombed a site in Damascus over the summer. And al-Sharaa was literally, he was really angry about that. And there are many who believe that Israel does not want a united Syria, but wants a fragmented Syria. So he has a lot of battles on the horizon. Let's take a break because I think al-Sharaa is a very interesting, figure. I'd interviewed Bashar Assad just the once. You also met him,
I
and he
interviewed
is
Bashar
yeah, yeah.
Assad when I
When you were
played
on Sky
journalist.
News,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But he couldn't communicate, man. The guy was so stiff. This guy
Oh,
looks like he was a born communicator, so he has that on his side. I hope he uses it well. Okay, let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to look at, I don't know, Jamie, but I think it's the weirdest national security strategy document that I've ever seen come out of any administration since I've been covering, foreign affairs. And let's go back. For sure, the European allies are majorly on the back foot, and it's dramatic. We'll take a break. Okay, we're back, Jamie and me, to talk about the new American, the new Trumpian, maybe the new Stephen Miller, the new J.D. Vance. I don't know, but a lot of, cooks have been in there, advancing their own interests and their own view of the world. It's called the, National Security Strategy, the first one of this term of the Trump administration. And just in short, the reaction from mainstream European allies is that this document, as Carl Bildt, our old friend, the former prime minister and foreign minister of Sweden, tweeted, this essentially puts America to the right of the far right in Europe. Basically putting Europe out into the cold, saying that they were going to challenge mainstream European parties and governments, challenge them, talk about bring in Russia into the group again, and also threaten civilizational erasure in Europe because of their immigration policies. So it is pretty dire. And I don't know, Jamie, should Europe listen? Should it not? Should it go its own way? Well, first, how did you react to it?
yes. Well, this is an attempt by some, smart people to try to weave together the weird priorities of President Trump. But I think that its core, there's a fundamental hypocrisy in the document, as President Trump said at the UN when he spoke. They believe in the sovereignty of nations, and they work very, very hard to focus on the fact that this is a world of nations, and transnationalism and globalism and all these phrases that they hate should be thrown aside and let nations run the worlds. And I agree with that. But then, instead of following their own principle of letting nations operate themselves, they
As opposed to what, by the way?
as opposed to world government or,
Oh, right. Okay.
that they're trying to claim the UN is a world government, and they're
Yeah.
trying to keep transnational organizations out of the business of
Right.
interfering in internal
Hmm.
affairs of countries, and that's for their own reasons. But that's a
Right.
principle that I share. that this is a world of countries and nations, and the sovereignty of nations have to be respected. But then they throw that whole idea out the window when it comes to what they don't like about the politics of European nations, where they don't like the fact that many European nations are tolerant countries that believe in immigration, legal immigration, and they come up with this crazy great replacement theory, as if there's some grand conspiracy going on to let European countries be taken over by the Muslims or civilization erasure. This is complete and utter nonsense. And coming from the United States, of all places, it goes against the basic idea of America. America is an idea, not an ethnicity, not a religion, not a particular type of person. America is the idea of a nation of laws and a nation built on democratic values. And America is a nation of immigrants. So this is a national security strategy of a muddled, hypocritical, contradictory set of principles, some of which I agree with, some of which make obvious sense, but it doesn't add up to anything but a big, uh, uh, essentially sticking a finger to the Europeans for the way they choose to run their countries. It's none
Yeah.
of our business.
Yeah. So I asked, it was breaking when I was there conducting a panel at the Doha Forum, and I asked who but Kaya Kallas, former frontline Baltic state prime minister of Estonia, and now the European Union's top foreign policy official. And this is what she said. I said, they look like they've made you the enemy and Russia the friend. What are you thinking? This is what she said.
What do you make of this? I mean, Europe's the enemy, you're the enemy.
No, I didn't read it like this. I actually read the European part. I haven't read the rest of it. Of course, there's a lot of criticism, but I think some of it is also true. If you look at Europe, it has been underestimating its own power towards Russia, for example. I mean, we should be more self-confident. That's for sure. And U.S. is still our biggest ally, and there I read it as well that we are still the biggest ally, and it's in the interest of the United States as well that Europe lasts.
Well, good luck with that. I've never seen so much weaving and dodging, and she's got a very hard head when it comes to understanding what's at stake, given that Russia is on their border. But look, there are others who say, other historians, people who've written, that yes, we should accept this. This is the Trump doctrine. We need to stand on our own 2 feet. We need to do this. We need to do that. And I'm like, really? Why? What's wrong with having an alliance with the strongest country in the whole wide world? You give it vital stuff, it gives you vital stuff. What is this divorce in the midst of a war? I really don't get it. I don't get it, and I don't get why the Europeans are on the back foot and they're like, yeah, yeah, he's right. We need more self confidence.
Here's what's going on. The Trump administration has some very smart people who believe in national security of the United States should guide our national security strategy. Then they've got some right-wing political people who are trying to turn national security into politics. They want to move Europe to the right. That's what Carl Bildt was pointing out. They want to use national security policies, use our laws, use our diplomacy to push European politics to the right. And this is a fundamental interference in the internal affairs of European countries. It goes against their whole principle of the sovereignty of nations. And it's just politics. It's just people in the Trump administration trying to see how they can criticize the center and the center left in Europe and promote the right in Europe. And
Yeah.
it has no
Yeah.
business in a national security strategy. It's not going to work. Europeans are going to vote and act on their national interests. They're not going to listen to this nonsense.
And I will say, though, it probably is going to have some kind of impact on the Russia Ukraine war because it was pretty warm towards Russia, although it did say we also need to have, I think it said, a viable, independent Ukrainian sovereign state. But the question is how, because already Trump is doubling down against Zelensky again. He's pissed off that Zelensky doesn't like his whatever plan it is that was very pro Russian, even though the tweaks. Don Jr. was at the Doha Forum apparently, and he railed against Ukraine. I mean, he came out and said, basically, the world is, we're tired of Ukraine. Um, and now Ukraine, Zelensky has been in London as we speak. He's meeting with Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, with the French President Macron and the German Chancellor Merz. They're all in London. What should they do? Because they can't just ditch the US, and you can't just let and leave Ukraine to the wolves.
Well, first of all, I think we should separate the Ukraine issue from this document. I've been involved in preparations of these national security documents. They're actually not that important. They're
Okay, but
just
what
a
about the
piece of
Ukraine
paper.
issue then?
Oh, I'll get to that. And so whatever it wrote about Ukraine is irrelevant.
Okay.
What matters in Ukraine is what the Europeans do to support Ukraine. What matters in Ukraine is whether the United States bases itself with this, essentially Neville Chamberlain plan for capitulation they're offering the Ukrainians. And what matters to Ukraine is what goes on the battlefield and whether the pressure of sanctions continues on Putin. And until Vladimir Putin changes his conclusion that he can somehow win this war, nothing is going to change in Ukraine. They're not going to give up. The Europeans are not going to stop helping. And all that you're talking about here is how the Europeans feel they need to make nice with Donald Trump. They need to not argue with him. They've concluded that it's easier just to go along and dodge and weave the way the foreign representative did in your question. And rather than confronting him, some European politicians want to take Trump on directly. Some have over this strategy, some will. But I think the major theme of European leaders is, we've got to work with Trump. We've got to be diplomatic with him. No point in getting in arguments. We're not going to end up solving anything. Let's focus on the substance. And on the substance,
Except that,
nothing
Jamie.
in Ukraine has changed.
Well, I'm trying to get that word in because actually, because of a lot of this nonsense that's been going on with interrupted, supply lines of weapons, interrupted, support for Ukraine by the United States. Actually, Putin is making advances, and they're quite significant. They're not going to, you know, beat the Ukrainians tomorrow, but they're making enough headway that it's thought that Putin really thinks he's in a really good place now. And the choice for Ukraine, as the Americans are saying, is between, or actually, I read it, I think it was maybe Tom Friedman or somebody, the difference between a dirty deal for Ukraine and a filthy deal for Ukraine. And that's a terrible place to be.
Well, yes, of course, that's right. Ukraine is having a tough time right now. I think primarily because the Chinese have helped Russia improve their drone capability, which is allowing them access to deeper battlefield capability on the front lines. But nothing has changed in the big picture. Russia still is expending huge resources. Men are dying in the tens of thousands for small pieces of territory. They're not taking over Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting back. They're using all their capability. The war isn't ending. They're not making big breakthroughs. Yes, they probably going to take the town of Pokrovsk by the end of the year. They claim they have. There's parts they have, they parts they haven't. But the basic thrust of the war hasn't changed. What needs to change is in the minds of one man, Vladimir Putin, when he realizes that Europe is all in for Ukraine. Europe is going to provide the weapons and support. They're going to figure out a way to do that. And the Ukrainians are not going to give up. And that's why I say in the big picture, it hasn't changed. But are there setbacks? Absolutely. It's a war. It's a miserable war. But Russia's has its setbacks too. Over 1 million Russians have died or been wounded, and that number continues to climb.
Yeah, I know. They've got to get on with it because this is really it's kind of crunch time now. But look, let us conclude with those segments and take a break and come back with our recommendations. Okay, we're back, Jamie and I, with the final piece of this episode, and that is our recommendations. So I'm going to go first this week because I'm rich. My heart is like bursting out of my chest trying to get this one out. Jamie, and I'm sure you read it, or maybe you didn't, but Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, did a Substack. It I can only think of the word spiteful against South Africa for having hosted the G20. And of course, the US government, this administration really hates the current South African administration, is favoring the whites and the Afrikaners there, including in high-level visits to the embassy there, bringing them into the United States on preferential visas. But basically, they decided to boycott. This is the US, the G20, and South Africa. And now they're basically saying that South Africa, you know, boycotted them. They're disinviting South Africa to the G20 being held in the United States next year. So I just want to commend to people just to read and see what it sounds like. Look for the Rubio Substack and then read the response to that Substack by the South African Foreign Minister, Ronald Lamola. It is really dignified. It is absolutely the response of a sovereign nation. It is chapter and verse on how they have tried to run their country with the aim of national unity. And he takes offense at the US saying it's just a quota system and they're, doing, grievance policies against the whites. And he lists it down to the last Mandela, basically, and says that Nelson Mandela was one of the great leaders of all time. Of course, remember, he was accused of being a terrorist, who put his whole presidency and the success of a new democratic South Africa, where everybody, not just the minority whites, were in control, where everybody had a chance, on national unity and trying to redress all those decades of imbalance. But it was so beautifully written that I thought people could read both foreign ministers and get a little bit of an insight, both Rubio and Lamola. And you can find Lamola's on the South African Foreign Ministry website.
Terrific. Well, I will read both of them.
You
I
read
didn't
it, it's
read
great.
I will. So I'm gonna do something a little unusual. I'm gonna say one obvious thing and one non-obvious thing. So I know much of the world is watching slow horses, and I was very late to the game, slow to slow horses, but I did start watching it. I've been through 5 seasons, and I have to admit it's a lot of fun.
It's a
It's a
lot of
lot of
fun.
fun because it's about London, and it's about MI5, and it's got one of the great actors of all time, Gary Oldman, playing a terrific character, and it's got some great story, lines. I think some of the seasons are better than others. I don't really like the seasons in which they, what I consider conspiracy theories, imagine, the MI5 killing their own agents all the time and having their own agents assassinated if it doesn't make them look good, which doesn't strike me as very realistic. But some of them are great. The one about the Russian sleeper agents was great. Now I'm going to do one, and it's a little bit personal, and forgive me for it. There's a great band. Their name is Betty, and I started watching them about 35 years ago in Washington. They're 2 lesbian sisters, Elizabeth Ziff and Amy Ziff, and they have a band that plays some of the funnest, most interesting, funny, exciting short it's a short show. We watched their Christmas show at the Public Theater last night. They play all over America. They come to Europe from time to time. When I was in the government, I was able to help get them on the list of, approved American cultural representatives so they could travel the world and, and now Trump has wiped them out, because
No.
they're yeah, of course because they're prominent lesbians. What was amazing about it, these were my first when I was a young man, I didn't know a lot of LGBT people, and this was my first group of friends, and they're just a lot of fun. Their name is Betty, and I recommend it.
Wow, that's a good recommendation, and I'm just horrified to hear what's come down the pike in this anti-DEI world. All right, well, I wish them good luck, and wow, that is the end for this episode. Thank you for listening. Make sure you follow our feed so that you never miss an episode. Remember, you can watch our episodes on YouTube as well. Just search for Christiane Amanpour Presents The X-Files on YouTube and subscribe to our channel. You can also listen for free on Global Player. Download it from the App Store or go to globalplayer.com. I got it right this week. And we will see you on Thursday for our bonus Q&A episode. We're answering your questions as usual. So keep them coming. You can email us at amanpourpod@global.com or find us on social media at amanpourpod. Over and out. Bye, Jamie.
Goodbye from New York City.
And London. And Doha.